Well, I think China is, very deliberately being provocative at the moment. I've discovered a phrase, Bev, known as wolf warrior diplomacy, which is named after a Chinese action movie of a few years ago and is now being applied to a sort of more assertive, frankly, more offensive type of Chinese diplomatic comment, insulting senior politicians, threatening economic retaliation. I don't think this is going to help China much in the long term, but what it is clearly designed to do is to distract attention from the problems of the origin of the virus. And I think to try to browbeat countries into saying nothing or saying very little. So this is a concern, and I think we're seeing examples of that in Canberra with the behaviour of the Chinese ambassador just over the last few days.
Is it posturing, is it rhetoric that we should be taking seriously at this point? As you pointed out, there are serious threats of boycotts of Australian goods and services.
Well, it's not unusual to have Chinese ambassadors hinting at boycotts. We had that in the past when the anti-interference laws were being passed into Parliament, and hints about Chinese students not coming to Australia. I don't think they need to be taken too seriously. What I find really puzzling, Bev, though, is we've got, the second most significant superpower in the world talking and behaving like we're used to seeing North Korea behave. We've been used for years to inflammatory rhetoric coming out of North Korea's spokespeople in the North Korean news agency, not so much Beijing. And I think you can perhaps read into that a sense of a little bit of panic in the party, that they're very worried about how this is playing internationally, what it's going to mean for China's standing long term. And so we're getting this sort of rather hyped up aggressive reaction, which I really don't think is going to help China at all in the long term.
It seems, though, that we are seeing a more determined Australian pushback. There's no stepping away by the Australian government on this.
I don't think our government can afford to do so, but yes, a sign of that is seeing Simon Birmingham as Trade Minister, who's normally very careful about the things he says, indicating that we can't back down. I think there's a couple of reasons for that, Bev. One is that I think our government, frankly, has just had enough of this browbeating type of diplomacy from China. And after the COVID experience knows that we have to push back and we have to be prepared to do and say things that are in our national interest. The other factor is I think our government will have a sense of the palpable anger in the Australian public, which is less reserved, less likely to look the other way because of trade concerns. And our government feels we have to address this. We've actually got to acknowledge that there are problems with how the Communist Party is operating, and we've got to be able to say something about it.
What, though, is the real likelihood of any effective international inquiry, even, because China's unlikely to cooperate?
Well, I agree. I don't think they will cooperate. I think it will be very much like the Russians refusing to cooperate with the Dutch inquiry into the shoot-down of the Malaysian Airlines aircraft. But that doesn't mean a formal investigation involving the world's major democracies would be a bad thing. I think, on the contrary, it's really important to try to get to the truth of this. I think it is helpful if it is something which is embarrassing to the Communist Party, because maybe that will actually force better behaviour rather than the pattern of lies and threats that we see coming from the party right now. And I think for our own populations, governments need to be seen to investigating this with a view to saying it can never happen again. And if that means we need to force some change on China, for example, closing down wet markets, well, so be it. Let's have that public discussion.
Has this really focused our intention on building a less China-dependent economy? We've talked about it, but we don't quite know how to disentangle ourselves.
I sure hope it does, because we are now seeing very starkly the consequences of over-dependence. of a situation where China simply feels it can basically tell us to shut up, to insult our senior ministers, to threaten economic coercion, simply because they don't like the suggestion that an inquiry should be held. That is a sign of a relationship that we should be trying to reduce our dependence on. And I think, in a funny way, COVID makes it possible for us to do that. If it forces our universities to think again about putting too much effort into the Chinese market and maybe looking more closely at Southeast Asia, if it forces our state premiers to revise the wisdom of signing Belt and Road agreements with China when the federal government and opposition doesn't want them to do that, that would be a very positive thing. So Australia can come out of this stronger if we're smart about it, and we don't just think that what we have to do is snap back to the type of relationship that we had, say, in December last year, which to me is now old history and simply, there is no return to that past.
Yeah, fascinating times. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks so much, Pete.